The pungent, choking scent of charred olive wood and ash hung heavy over the desecrated temples of Athens. Bronze-greaved boots marched in strict, unified rhythm through the gray soot of a shattered city. It was 479 BCE, and a brutal historical paradox was unfolding in the Mediterranean. The Persian Imperial army, led by the veteran commander Mardonius, had successfully marched south and burned the Greek capital to the ground. Logically, the campaign should have concluded with total subjugation. Yet, despite standing as conquerors atop the ashes of their enemy, the invaders were slowly losing the war. Exactly 1 year earlier, 300 Spartans and a small contingent of allies had bled to death at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. They did not win, but they bought the Hellenic forces the single most valuable asset in military logistics: time. Young Mardonius now commanded an occupation force stranded far from the imperial center, facing an enemy that refused to break. The period of tactical evasion was over. Pouring from the Peloponnese, a massive, unprecedented coalition of tens of thousands of heavily armored Greek infantry marched north toward the plains of Boeotia. They were not deploying to negotiate terms or defend a new border. They were marching to collect a staggering blood debt and force a final reckoning. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we analyze the Battle of Plataea, the day the Greeks avenged Thermopylae. The road to this unprecedented military mobilization was paved with mutual suspicion and the blistering, relentless heat of the Aegean summer. Months prior, the crushing naval victory at Salamis had forced Emperor Xerxes to withdraw the bulk of his armada to Asia, but the invasion was far from extinguished. He left behind his most capable general, Mardonius, commanding a hand-picked corps of elite imperial infantry, heavily armed cavalry, and thousands of allied Greek troops from Thebes. Mardonius understood that he did not necessarily need to defeat the Hellenic League in open combat if he could fracture them from within. By occupying the ruins of Athens for a second time, he applied maximum psychological pressure. The alliance was practically destroying itself. The Spartan government, guided by deep-seated isolationism, was stubbornly building a massive defensive wall across the narrow isthmus of Corinth, entirely content to let the northern territories burn so long as the Peloponnese remained secure. Outraged by this strategic abandonment, the Athenians, whose families were starving as refugees on the island of Salamis, delivered a chilling ultimatum to the Spartan Senate. If the Lacedaemonian heavy infantry did not march north immediately, the powerful Athenian navy would defect and accept a Persian alliance. This was a strategic nightmare. A combined Persian and Athenian fleet could easily bypass the fortifications at the isthmus and land imperial troops directly on the beaches of Laconia. Forced into a corner by the sheer tactical gravity of this threat, the Spartan regent Pausanias finally ordered the mobilization. Tens of thousands of hoplites, burdened by the immense weight of bronze breastplates, greaves, and heavy ash spears, and began the grueling trek out of the peninsula. They marched under a baking sun, their synchronized rhythmic tread kicking up vast columns of dry earth that clung to sweat-soaked leather armor and parched throats. The political stalemate was finally broken, and the largest allied army in Greek history was lumbering toward the frontier. But diplomacy would soon be replaced by a forced march, because Mardonius made a tactical move that left the Greeks no choice but to fight. Mardonius had deliberately chosen his ground. Pulling his forces back to the northern bank of the Asopus River, he anchored a sprawling, wooden palisaded encampment in the open plains of Boeotia. This was textbook imperial cavalry terrain, meticulously selected to maximize his mobility advantage. When Pausanias and the allied vanguard crested the rugged foothills of Mount Scythaeron on the southern side, the scale of the standoff became immediately visible. Below them, deployed an expeditionary force estimated between 70,000 and 120,000 men. The Persian lines represented a vast integration of military doctrines: lightly armored archers carrying wicker sparrowbearer shields, highly lethal Mede and Bactrian horsemen, and thousands of hardened Greek infantry from Thebes who had allied with the imperial government. Opposite them, the Hellenic coalition assembled roughly 80,000 troops along the ridges. At the absolute core of this heavy infantry formation stood 10,000 elite Lacedaemonians, anchoring the critical right wing with rigid, uncompromising discipline, while the Athenians held the left. The contrast in military philosophy was absolute. The imperial army relied on rapid maneuvers, synchronized arrow volleys, and cavalry skirmishing, designed to bleed an enemy formation dry before initiating a decisive flanking strike. The Greek phalanx, conversely, was a blunt, heavy instrument, engineered entirely for the relentless forward momentum of close-quarters shock combat. They depended on interlocking shields and thick bronze armor to absorb incoming projectiles until they could close the distance. Between these two vastly different war machines ran the Asopus. The continuous rushing roar of the river echoed through the valley, acting as a profound psychological barrier that separated the two massive encampments. To ford the churning water in either direction meant breaking stride, surrendering formation coherence, and offering the defending side a catastrophic tactical advantage. Neither commander was willing to commit unforced suicide. Pausanias outright refused to march his heavy infantry down into the flatlands, where imperial cavalry could easily outflank and dismantle his rigid lines. Mardonius, demonstrating equal restraint, refused to order his lighter troops uphill against an unbroken bristling wall of ash spears. The battlefield stagnated into a tense, high-stakes stalemate. Days dragged into over a week of localized skirmishing. Both armies were rapidly burning through supply convoys, attempting to feed nearly 200,000 men and thousands of horses in a single valley. Both commanders knew the river was a geographical death trap, so they waited until logistics forced a fatal decision. Under the shroud of a moonless night, Pausanias issued the single most dangerous command in ancient warfare: a coordinated, large-scale retreat under the cover of darkness. Without water, the Greek position was untenable. The objective was a tactical fallback to a territory known as the Island, a patch of land closer to the city of Plataea, where fresh springs flowed safely behind the hills. However, moving tens of thousands of heavily armored infantry through broken terrain without modern communications is an absolute logistical nightmare. There were no signal flares, only exhausted runners navigating by starlight. The primary sensation was the heavy rhythmic thud of bronze shields scraping against leather and iron cuirasses as massive columns of men blindly bumped into one another. The immense tactical pressure of executing a withdrawal with a massive imperial army camped just across the river caused command and control to instantly disintegrate. The center of the Hellenic line, comprised of various Peloponnesian allies, began their march, but completely lost their bearings in the pitch black. Driven by the fear of being caught in the open, they overshot the designated rendezvous point entirely. They did not stop until they reached the Heraeon, a temple right outside the walls of Plataea, effectively removing themselves from the primary defensive line. Worse still, the critical right wing descended into outright insubordination. A Spartan battalion commander named Amphiaratus flatly refused the order to march. Bound by the absolute uncompromising laws of Lacedaemonian honor, he argued that yielding ground to the enemy was an unforgivable act of cowardice. According to historical accounts, he hoisted a massive rock and slammed it at Pausanias' feet, declaring it his formal ballot to stay and fight. Pausanias was forced into a desperate, hushed, screaming match with his subordinate. wasting precious hours of darkness trying to compel a single stubborn captain. Sensing the delay on the right, the Athenian contingent on the left halted their own withdrawal. They sent messengers scrambling through the uneven terrain to determine why the Spartans were immobilized. Cohesion evaporated. The disciplined, impenetrable wall of bronze that had deterred the Imperial cavalry for 11 days had shattered itself from within. Thousands of men stood idle, gripping their spears, listening to frantic and conflicting commands echoing faintly through the night air. By the time Pausanias finally forced his rearguard to move, the eastern sky was already turning gray, stripping away the safety of the dark. The Greek forces were now dangerously strung out into 3 completely isolated contingents, separated by miles of hills and plains, entirely incapable of supporting one another. The phalanx was broken. When the sun rose, Mardonius looked across the valley and saw his enemy divided. A commander's dream or a perfectly disguised nightmare? Mardonius did not hesitate to exploit the geographical rupture. Recognizing the deeply fractured state of the Hellenic line, the Imperial commander ordered an immediate, full-scale offensive, directing the overwhelming weight of his vanguard squarely at the isolated Spartan right wing, although he deployed his highly mobile cavalry first, sending thousands of horsemen charging across the Asopus River to pin Pausanias's men in place against the rugged terrain. Before the Lacedaemonians could maneuver to higher, safer ground, the regular Imperial infantry arrived in force and executed their signature tactical doctrine. They drove their tall, tightly woven wicker shields deep into the dry earth, forming an interlocking, formidable barricade known as the Sparabara. From behind this defensive wall, wave after wave of Persian archers unleashed a relentless, continuous barrage into the densely packed Greek formation. The physical and psychological pressure was staggering. The sheer kinetic impact of the assault drummed relentlessly against the phalanx, defined by the sharp and sickening thwack of iron-tipped shafts, violently piercing wood, unprotected flesh, and solid bronze armor under the blazing morning sun. Despite the escalating visible casualties, the Spartan heavy infantry did not move a single pace forward. Their refusal to charge was not rooted in fear or hesitation, but in absolute, uncompromising religious discipline. Pausanias, operating under strict Lacedaemonian martial law, would absolutely not order an advance until the battlefield seers produced favorable omens from the ritual animal sacrifices. As the arrow storm intensified overhead, priests urgently slaughtered goats immediately behind the front lines, searching the entrails for divine permission to engage the enemy. Repeatedly, the omens were declared hostile. Repeatedly, the unyielding command was given to hold the line. And this was the ultimate agonizing test of the hoplite doctrine. To charge without orders was an act of treason. To break formation and flee was immediate death. Thousands of elite heavy infantrymen stood locked in their rigid ranks, absorbing the punishing kinetic force of a mobilized Imperial firing squad. Men fell heavily, their cuirasses dented and pierced, blood pooling in the dry dust beneath their bronze greaves. Yet the survivors silently stepped over the dead to close the gaps in the shield wall. The extreme tactical restraint required to absorb a relentless onslaught of projectiles defied basic human instinct. The Spartans were bleeding out, dying without swinging a single weapon until the seers finally found the sign they were looking for. With the confirmation of favorable entrails yelled across the lines, the agonizing restraint of the Lacedaemonians vanished in a single, roaring exhalation. Pausanias unleashed the phalanx. The sudden shift from static endurance to violent forward momentum was absolute. Shouted commands from the battalion captains cut through the din, instantly transforming the defensive bronze wall into a massive, heavily armored battering ram. The Spartans and their Tegean allies surged down the rugged slopes of Ky, picking up lethal momentum. The tactical pressure on the battlefield inverted within seconds. For the Imperial infantry, the sight of 10,000 hoplites closing the distance at a dead run was a logistical nightmare. Their wicker sparabara barricades were designed to stop arrows, not the sheer kinetic mass of a synchronized moving wall. The collision was deafening. There was no elegant swordsmanship, only a terrifying, crushing press of bodies. The metallic, grinding screech of heavy ash spears splintering against iron scales and solid bronze shields drowned out the war cries. In this confined, claustrophobic front, the physical mechanics of the phalanx reigned supreme. The hoplites utilized the tremendous forward weight of the men in the ranks behind them, using their heavy Asopus shields to physically bulldoze the lighter Imperial troops backward into the dirt. The Persian infantry possessed undeniable courage, repeatedly rushing forward to grab and snap the long Greek spears with their bare hands. But their lighter tunics and short daggers were fundamentally incapable of piercing the thick, interlocking bronze breastplates of the Lacedaemonian vanguard. All the melee devolved into a grueling contest of sheer friction and leverage. Recognizing his vanguard was crumbling under the immense physical weight, Mardonius personally committed his elite Imperial Guard. Mounted on a towering white horse, the Persian commander plunged directly into the chaotic epicenter of the fighting, rallying his breaking infantry through sheer force of will. Surrounded by his bravest heavy cavalrymen, he briefly stabilized the collapsing center. However, positioning the Supreme Commander in the deadliest crucible of close-quarters combat carried a catastrophic risk. In the blinding dust and grinding press of shields, a Spartan hoplite hurled a heavy stone that struck Mardonius squarely. The Imperial general was thrown violently from his saddle, instantly disappearing beneath the trampling boots of the very troops he commanded. The psychological shockwave of his death was immediate and irreversible. Deprived of their charismatic center of gravity, the elite Persian guard fought to the last man to protect his body, but the broader infantry lines rapidly disintegrated under the relentless forward march of the Greeks. The Persian center shattered with the fall of their commander, but the battle wasn't over. A fresh, untouched core of the Imperial army was just arriving on the field. Commanding 40,000 reserve troops, the Persian subordinate Artabazus watched the Imperial standard fall and the vanguard disintegrate. He understood the absolute fragility of ancient military hierarchies. Without the supreme commander to anchor the massive, multi-ethnic coalition, tactical cohesion evaporated instantly. Rather than feeding his untouched core into a collapsing front line, Artabazus ordered an immediate, disciplined withdrawal. He turned his columns northward, abandoning the expeditionary force to begin the long punishing march back toward Asia. While the center dissolved into a rout, a vicious, concentrated civil war raged on the opposite end of the valley. The Athenian heavy infantry had finally engaged the Median Greeks of Thebes, who had openly allied with the imperial government. This was not a clash of foreign empires, but a deeply personal, localized hatred. The Theban hoplites fought with desperate, uncompromising ferocity, locking their shields against their southern neighbors. They maintained a grinding, exhausting stalemate that left hundreds dead in the dry dirt before their line finally buckled, forcing a disorganized retreat toward the safety of their city walls. Simultaneously, the fleeing remnants of the Persian infantry scrambled behind the massive wooden palisades of their fortified camp, frantically barricading the gates. The pursuing Spartans, structurally unaccustomed to siege warfare, struggled to dismantle the elevated defenses until the victorious Athenians arrived to reinforce the assault. Once the combined Hellenic heavy infantry tore down the timber walls, the engagement ceased to be a tactical battle and became a systematic eradication. The overpowering copper stench of blood rapidly saturated the splintered wooden barricades and the damp, trampled earth inside the enclosure. Trapped within their own fortifications, the imperial troops had no room to maneuver, no formations to hold, and nowhere to run. The Greek phalanx advanced methodically through the dense network of tents, wielding their ash spears with cold, rhythmic efficiency. They pinned the defenders against the rear walls, leaving virtually no survivors among the tens of thousands trapped inside. The Persian threat was eradicated, but the blood spilled at Plataea would forge a completely new, dangerous order in the Mediterranean. The absolute eradication of the Imperial Expeditionary Force was only half of the strategic triumph. On the very same afternoon, miles across the Aegean Sea, the Allied Hellenic fleet launched a synchronized amphibious assault on the beaches of Mycale, systematically burning the surviving remnants of Emperor Xerxes' armada to the waterline. The Persian invasion of mainland Europe was not merely halted, it was permanently, irrevocably dismantled. The sheer volume of military plunder left scattered across the plains of Boeotia defied ancient calculation. From the melted armor, shields, and weapons of the defeated dead, the victors cast a massive offering to the gods. The defining visual of this victory became the cold, silent brass of the Serpent Column towering at the sanctuary of Delphi, its coiled metal inscribed forever with the names of the 31 contributing city-states. The 300 Lacedaemonians who fell holding the narrow pass were finally avenged, but the unprecedented military unity that achieved that vengeance was already dying in the dirt of Plataea. With the existential threat of the imperial government completely removed, the fragile alliance immediately fractured under its own weight. Athens rapidly leveraged its unchallenged naval supremacy to forge its own aggressive maritime empire. Plataea saved the Greek peninsula from foreign subjugation, only to set the stage for a devastating, decades-long geopolitical conflict between Sparta and Athens that would ultimately tear their civilization apart from the inside. Please subscribe to our channel to relive heroic chapters of history with us.